you, Ed, for joining us at Griffith Business School, Centre for Sustainable Enterprise. And this afternoon we're running a workshop with you as the main person, talking about pragmatism and stakeholder theory. Is this a problem with stakeholder theory that you need to put the word pragmatism in there?
Well, I think the problem is in the perception of what stakeholder theory is.
What do you mean? After 25 years, people still don't know what
Well,
stakeholder theory is?
yeah, I think that says I haven't explained it very well. I guess, but I'm not going to try again. That's for sure. One take on stakeholder theory is it's sort of versus shareholder theory, and they each have a sort of different normative base to those things. And so what the philosophers like to do is they like to say, well, stakeholder theory needs this. You need to be clear about the normative basis of it. What really are those bedrock, foundational, ain't no maybe so values that give rise to stakeholder theory, and how are those different from shareholder theory? And I think that's, let me put it as a pragmatist would, not very useful on several fronts. One, it assumes that there are some foundational questions that can be answered, and that it's the philosophers and ethicists who can answer those questions that are somehow independent of history and culture and our being in the world. And I don't think that's true.
And isn't it also, doesn't that dichotomize something that doesn't need dichotomizing?
Yes, and that
suggests
yes.
that shareholders are in opposition to stakeholders, which of course everybody who's ever run a business knows is not true at all.
Is completely false. And so there's the opposition between shareholders and stakeholders. There's the argument that I don't think you need to have this sort of normative basis of things. It dichotomizes normative from descriptive. In a way that's, I mean, think about it now. When you use the word stakeholder, just use the word. You're already doing something normative. You're saying, hey, look, these folks count too.
And shareholders are stakeholders anyway.
And shareholders are stakeholders as well. So I think that enterprise of trying to find some philosophical foundations, of which I've been criticized in countless journal articles for, is what one of my philosophical heroes, Richard Rorty, would call a foundational enterprise, in that it tries to wrestle the world to the ground rather than start from where we are and try to see how we can improve it.
So is this one of the ways that you see the theory, if we can call it a theory, since 1984, that it's evolved, both in your writings and the way people have written about it and the way you think about it?
I think that's right. It has to evolve so that we have, stakeholder theory has to accommodate a pluralism of points of view and a pluralism of values. That doesn't say that any value point of view will do, but it is to say there are lots of ways to run a business. There are lots of ways to run a business that create value for stakeholders, that do it in a sustainable way, that has business people act responsibly. And I don't know the one and only one way all businesses ought to be run. Now, maybe some philosophers sitting in an ivory tower somewhere know that, but I don't.
But isn't also stakeholder theory really a theory of social democracy? It's about participation and accountability and materiality and reporting, all of those things at a societal level, not just at a business level.
Well, I think that's possible, and one of the ways my own thinking is going is to try and figure out what the connection is between business and other societal institutions. I think we have to see business as embedded in society rather than separate from society. The GFC makes this very clear. If you see business as separate from everything else, then what happens is you get in this cycle of it's separate. It doesn't have the same sort of normal ethical norms that we have, and then something screws up, and then we regulate, and then but it's still separate. What we got to do is understand how business is embedded in society. Now,
but is this a bigger problem, say, for the U.S. political economy than it is, say, for one of your neighbours like Canada or, say, Australia, where we are now?
Maybe. There is an idea that civil society counts more in Australia in Canada, certainly in the North Carolina.
But also the
countries,
government.
Europe.
I mean, people
Well,
generally
civil
accept
society
in,
and
say,
government
Canada
count-
and Australia, that
yeah.
government is generally a good thing, that it delivers services that we like, whereas
Yeah.
that's the opposite model in the US.
Yeah, well,
isn't it?
again, certainly our long history of the distrust of government, distrust of big institutions is
Long-standing, yeah.
long-standing. However, there's something more subtle going on here, in which while Australian and Canadian and Danish society may be kinder and gentler in some sense, in some of those places the separation of business is still very sharp. And so
Separation of business from what?
from civil society, etc. So people will take the stakeholder idea and they'll say, oh, that's about civil society, that's about NGO. There's running the business, and then there's stakeholder engagement. And stakeholder engagement is how you deal with government and NGOs.
It's apparently separate from.
And it's separate
Which
from, in
is
some
a
sense,
ridiculous hypothesis,
running the
isn't it?
business. Yeah, but it's an idea, it's an interpretation of stakeholder theory that is very broad. It's in part the identification of stakeholder theory with corporate social responsibility.
But isn't the other problem here this separation between apparently government, civil society, and business?
Yeah.
There are so many different models of business that exist, from mutuality to cooperatives to
Right.
shareholders, etc., that exist in all societies. So why do we need to make these separations, especially when so many governments are operating like businesses now?
Well, again, maybe I'm violently agreeing with you. We don't want to make that separation, but we need a unit of analysis in thinking about business that lets us not make that separation. That's how I have to think about stakeholders. I think about institutions too broad, because ultimately the manager wants to figure out what am I going to do? How am I going to try to influence these relationships or find partnerships here? And it's stakeholder theory is ultimately, I believe, a theory about what good management is. How do you start, build, and grow a great company? Not
so that relates as much to a university as to a company, then?
Sure. I don't see why. I don't see why you couldn't think about a stakeholder theory of universities. There are lots of people that have taken a stakeholder idea and applied it in education, not just universities, but primary, secondary schools as well. There's a whole literature on that as well. So there's a level at which stakeholder theory is, let's try to get the unit of analysis right. And the unit of analysis is groups and individuals and relationships, right? Business is a set of relationships.
So what's the one thing you've learned most in the last 25 years in talking about this? What's the one thing that you think, goodness, that really is a learning point?
I originally thought the key insight of a stakeholder theory was there are multiple stakeholders, their interest conflict, and we need to sort that out. I now think that's not the key insight. I think the key insight is, in business, stakeholder interests are joint. A successful business figures out how to take the interest of customers, suppliers, employees, communities, interpret it as civil society, government, however you want, and the people with the money, and get those interests going in the same direction. Where there are conflicts, you can make trade-offs, but that's the easy way out. You need to take the conflict, use the conflict to figure out how to create more value for all. Conflict of interest, conflict of values is the fuel for capitalism. Because capitalism, first and foremost, is a system of social cooperation.
And competition.
It's a system of social cooperation. Competition is a second-order property.
Right.
In a free society, it gives people options given how the other institutions are arranged. But what makes capitalism work is our desire to create. Our desire to work together, to cooperate, to create something which no one of us can create alone. That's the real insight, I think, of stakeholder theory. Not the idea that there are these competing interests. That takes the old story and bolts stakeholder theory onto that. And I want to drop the old story.
How are we doing in terms of dropping the old story?
Some days, let's see, today is Thursday. I think we're doing pretty well on Thursdays. Tuesdays, I'm not so sure. It really varies. Certainly, if I think back long enough, way back in 1978, one of my mentors, Jim Imshoff at Wharton, and I wrote a paper called Stakeholder Management. And we sent it to a business journal, just to list as a working paper. They listed working papers. The editor calls me and says, hey, we'll list this as a working paper. but you should know there's a horrible typo in the title. And I said, really, what is it? So, well, the title says stakeholder management. We know you mean stockholder. Don't worry, we'll change it for you. So if against that context, we're doing great.
Yep. I can tell you a similar story. 20 years ago, your book's just come out, and if you typed in stakeholder into Microsoft spell check, it automatically corrected it to shareholder
Yes.
or stockholder, automatically. And then about 5 years later, they corrected the spell check, and it didn't do that.
That's right. That's exactly right. I had actually had to correct the spell check. I had to put it in the dictionary
Yep.
of my of.
I had the
of
same
my first one.
experience. Yeah.
So I actually think, you know, if you maybe I'm just too much of a naive American optimist here, but I actually think we're changing the world. I mean, I think we're changing the world here. I don't just mean you and I. I mean, the thousands of people out trying to start businesses that create value for stakeholders. Some of them are social enterprises, or some of them are social entrepreneurs. Some of them are for-profit entrepreneurs. Some of them are large companies that we work with who are trying to do better and who are trying to get this right. So I think really there is a sort of revolution afoot about
Which
this.
leads us into the public seminar which you're doing tonight, which is on rethinking capitalism. I think you're calling it responsible capitalism, aren't you? So what is your model of responsible capitalism, and doesn't this posit that capitalism at the moment is irresponsible?
Well, it may. I'll leave that to other people. There are plenty of people talking about who the sinners are, etc. I think responsible capitalism says we need a new story about business. That much is clear to me. And
Sorry,
however,
can I just interrupt? A new story about business or a new story about capitalism? As they're not necessarily the same thing.
well, maybe not. So let me be sure. I'm interested in business, right? And I think when we get the story about business right, we'll be able to define a capitalism that works. So let me say I'm interested in sort of a new story about business, and let me just equivocate on business and capitalism for a minute. And the old story says capitalism works because people are greedy little bastards that are trying to do each other in. All they're trying to do is make as much money as possible. Don't watch them real closely. They'll cheat. And to act for others, they need to be incentivized, etc. And the only group that counts is the owners.
Is this Adam Smith, an invisible hand?
It actually
they
is.
Need to be incentivized to be
It's
greedy
actually
to
not.
help others?
It's actually not
It's
Adam
not
Smith.
Adam
That
Smith.
is one of the great myths of our time. Adam Smith actually understood responsible capitalism. Many people who followed Adam Smith didn't. You have to remember Adam Smith was a professor of moral philosophy, and there's quite a bit of evidence that he thought his main contribution was the theory of moral sentiments, not the wealth of nations, even though it was the wealth of nations that made him some money and able to live. Interesting new biography of Smith around those things that just come out. So that old story of business, which you see, and we teach in business schools, I think is no longer useful.
So you think generally in business schools we teach that greed is good because it will deliver to most people in the end?
Yeah, I don't think we don't put it like that.
No.
We put it in other terms. We put it in terms of, look, the only thing that counts is maximizing profits. The total performance of a business is equated with maximizing profits, and that's all that counts. And there's an ethical story underneath that, which I think the last 30 years in ethics has laid bare. For people in business ethics, people in corporate citizenship and social responsibility, etc. The GFC has, of course, laid that out for everybody to see.
Yep.
Whatever the new story turns out to be, I think it's got to go something like this. We need people to be responsible for the effects of their actions on others. Ethics doesn't get off the ground without that. That's a pretty basic idea from Plato, Confucius on. We have to create value in a way that's sustainable, that leaves things for our children. If you don't believe in future generations, think about your children and their children. Most people want to do that in a way that treats people with respect and dignity, and profits count. So we have to put ethics, responsibility, sustainability at the same level in the new story as profits are.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one way to think about that is to go back to business and say, well, so one anchor for that is to think about what you stand for as a business. What's your purpose? That's an individual question, but it's a business question as well. If we can put thinking about purpose front and center, where purpose is not just make as much money as you can. I think that's a logic mistake. I need red blood cells to live. It doesn't follow that the purpose of my life is to make red blood cells. Even if I need to really, I've had some tough things happen, I really got to think about making red blood cells now. And I got to do the things that you do when you try to make red blood cells. It still doesn't follow the purpose of my life is to make red blood cells. Purpose is something different. Businesses have to have profits. I'm willing to grant my colleagues in finance the beauty of their theory and say they must have profits at the weighted average cost of capital. No problem. It doesn't follow that that's the purpose of a business. And so purpose is something else. Most entrepreneurs you talk to have a purpose. Yes, they want to make money, and they've got some crazy idea they want to use to change the world.
So Ed Freeman's purpose in life is to change the way we think about business and to change business, and therefore to help deliver a new model of capitalism, but also to change the way business schools work and what they teach, and change the way in which we do research.
Well, maybe a little more modest. I would say
I'm not suggesting you can do it all by yourself, but
my purpose is I want to just contribute to the conversation around doing that. You know, there are lots of people doing this. You as well, and that's why I'm optimistic, because certainly 30 years ago there were people thinking about this, but not nearly as much as is today. So I think there's been, and maybe the GFC, which I know didn't have as big an impact here, but in the U.S. it had a huge impact. That may well be a tipping point for us, because you see students much more interested in things like responsible capitalism than I've ever seen in the past.
So final question to you then, given that we're talking about change and you're feeling that we are moving in the right direction, are you an optimist or a pessimist in terms of humanity's ability to continue to live on this planet?
Well, people say all the time, we got to save the planet, and I appreciate that. I actually think the planet's going to be just fine. We may not be here, but I think the planet's going to be fine unless we do something really stupid, like blow it into bits. It depends on the day of the week.
Some days you get out of bed and you're a pessimist.
I think there's a time when it's a time where we could go either way. I'm reminded of a great blues guitarist named Warren Haynes, who has said, when you play the blues, it doesn't matter how many notes you play, you just have to mean the notes that you play. Now, it seems to me we're at a time where we got to figure out what notes we mean. And hopefully we get enough experiments going of people who mean it, not just trying to make money and maximize profit, but who mean it, who've got something at stake. We get enough experiments going, and enough of them work. And we see that in a holistic enough way that our children's generations have a chance.
I think talking about the blues is probably a great place to stop this interview. Thank you very much indeed, Ed.